Ethan Foster had always prided himself on being a devoted husband and a soon-to-be doting father. After years of climbing the corporate ladder, he had finally reached a point where he could afford to take paternity leave, a luxury many fathers didn't have. His wife, Sophia, had been ecstatic when he suggested he take a few months off to bond with their newborn daughter, Lily. Their life seemed ideal, at least that was what Ethan believed. Sophia had met Ethan in college, and their love had blossomed quickly. He was the dependable, hard-working type, loyal to a fault. Their marriage had been built on a foundation of trust, or so he thought. But beneath the surface, Sophia felt a growing restlessness. The transition into motherhood had been overwhelming, and though Ethan was supportive, something inside her yearned for more. At work, she was seen as the ambitious and talented marketing executive, always poised and articulate. But there was one person who saw her as more than just an employee. Her boss, Nathan Caldwell. Nathan was the complete opposite of Ethan. He was assertive, commanding, and exuded an air of untamed confidence. He was the kind of man who took what he wanted, and Sophia had found herself drawn to that energy more than she cared to admit. Ethan had always admired Sophia's dedication to her career. He had met her when they were both still struggling to find their footing in their respective fields. While he had opted for the steady, predictable route in finance, she had ventured into the ever-changing world of marketing, where creativity and risk-taking were necessary. It was one of the things that had initially drawn him to her boldness, her drive. But now, as he spent his days at home changing diapers and singing lullabies, he couldn't help but feel the distance growing between them. Sophia, meanwhile, struggled with the overwhelming expectations of motherhood. She had thought she was ready for it, excited, even, but the reality was far more difficult than she had imagined. The sleepless nights, the constant feedings, the loss of autonomy. She loved Lily with all her heart, but there were moments she felt suffocated by the relentless demands of parenting. And with Ethan at home, assuming so much of the responsibility, she felt something she never expected: resentment. She knew it was irrational. Ethan was doing exactly what she had wanted, stepping up as a father, giving her the freedom to return to work without guilt. And yet, there was an undeniable tension building between them. Conversations had become mechanical, centered around schedules and baby supplies rather than dreams and desires. The intimacy they once shared had faded, replaced by exhaustion and routine. Nathan Caldwell had noticed. He had an uncanny ability to read people, and it didn't take long for him to see that Sophia was restless. It started with casual conversations in the break room, light-hearted teasing about her newfound motherhood. He offered her an escape from the monotony, an ear that listened without judgment. He made her feel seen in a way Ethan hadn't in months. The first time Nathan invited her out for drinks after work, she hesitated. She had never been the kind of woman who flirted with danger. But something about the way he looked at her, the way he spoke with effortless confidence, made her crave his attention. She told herself it was harmless, just a drink between colleagues. But deep down, she knew she was playing with fire. As Ethan rocked Lily to sleep that night, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond his reach, Sophia sat across from Nathan in a dimly lit bar, laughing in a way she hadn't in a long time. And in that moment, she felt a dangerous thrill coursing through her veins, the first crack forming in the foundation of the life she and Ethan had built. Sophia stared at her reflection in the mirror, her heart pounding. She had spent extra time on her appearance that evening, not enough to be obvious, but enough to make a difference. A touch more mascara, a dress that hugged her curves just right. It was ridiculous, really. She had told herself this was just dinner, just a friendly outing between colleagues. Yet, deep down, she knew better. Nathan had chosen an upscale restaurant. one that exuded quiet sophistication, dim lighting, and an air of exclusivity. It was the kind of place meant for whispered conversations and stolen glances. When she arrived, he was already waiting, his confident smirk making her stomach flip. "You look stunning," he murmured as he pulled out a chair for her. Sophia felt a rush of warmth at his words, a sensation she hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't that Ethan never complimented her. He did, in passing, between diaper changes and half-finished meals. But with Nathan, it was different. There was an intensity in the way he looked at her, a hunger that sent a thrill through her veins. As the evening unfolded, their conversation flowed effortlessly. They talked about work, their ambitions, their frustrations. Nathan shared stories of his past, his travels, his experiences. His voice low, smooth, magnetic. Sophia found herself leaning in, drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain. When he reached across the table and traced his fingers lightly over her wrist, she didn't pull away. The touch was brief, almost innocent, but it sent electricity shooting through her body. She knew then, this wasn't just harmless flirtation anymore. She was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something irreversible. Back at home, Ethan paced the nursery, rocking Lily in his arms. She had been fussy all evening, refusing to settle down. He glanced at the clock, frowning. Sophia had said she would be home by 9. It was now almost 10. He wasn't the jealous type. He trusted his wife, had always believed in the strength of their marriage. But lately, something had felt off. She had been distant, preoccupied. He had chalked it up to the stress of returning to work, to the adjustments of parenthood. But now, as he stood in the dim glow of the night light, an uneasy feeling settled in his gut. When Sophia finally walked through the door, she was breathless, her cheeks flushed. "Sorry I'm late," she said quickly, setting her purse down. Work dinner ran longer than expected. Ethan studied her, noting the way she avoided his gaze. There was something different about her, something almost alive. "Everything okay?" he asked casually. "Of course." She forced a smile, brushing past him. "I'm exhausted. I think I'll shower and head to bed." Ethan watched as she disappeared down the hall, a nagging suspicion creeping into his mind. He wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. But a small, insidious voice whispered in the back of his head, planting seeds of doubt. Sophia had never intended to become this kind of woman. She had never pictured herself as someone who could betray the man who had loved her unconditionally. And yet, here she was, spinning lie after lie, sinking deeper into the abyss of her own desires. The first time she had met Nathan outside the confines of work, she had convinced herself it was innocent. But innocence had been lost the moment she crossed the threshold of his apartment. It started with text messages, short, fleeting moments of stolen words that sent her heart racing. Then came the lunches, the late nights at the office that weren't really about work. Now, she was in too deep, tangled in a web of passion and deception she didn't know how to escape. Or worse, she didn't want to escape. Ethan, ever trusting, never questioned her absences at first. He was exhausted from long nights with Lily, too distracted to notice the way her kisses became mechanical, the way she pulled away when he reached for her in the dark. But as the days turned into weeks, the cracks in their marriage grew wider. He wasn't blind. He could feel the distance, the way she slipped through his fingers like sand. One night, as Sophia sat across from Nathan in a dimly lit restaurant, she felt the full weight of what she was doing. The way he looked at her, hungry, possessive, made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. But beneath that thrill was a gnawing guilt that wouldn't go away. "We should stop," she said suddenly, surprising even herself. Nathan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Do you want to stop?" "I should," she whispered, but the words felt empty. He reached for her hand, tracing circles on her palm with his thumb. "But you don't," he said smoothly, a smirk playing on his lips. And just like that, she was lost again. Back home, Ethan sat in the living room, staring at the clock. It was past midnight. She had told him she had an urgent project at work. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. He picked up his phone and dialed her number. It rang and rang before going to voicemail. A knot tightened in his chest. This wasn't right. With a deep breath, he stood up and walked to the nursery. Lily was fast asleep, her tiny fingers curled into fists. He watched her, feeling the kind of love that was immeasurable, yet tinged with something else, doubt. His marriage had once been unshakable, but now, it felt like sand slipping through his fingers. If Sophia wasn't where she said she was, where was she? Sophia knew she was walking a dangerous line, but she had convinced herself that she could manage it, that she could keep both worlds from colliding. She had become an expert at deception, weaving intricate excuses, carefully choosing her words, hiding the scent of Nathan's cologne before stepping into her home. But secrets have a way of demanding to be uncovered, and hers were no exception. Ethan had been watching. He wasn't a fool, nor was he blind. He had seen the way Sophia's eyes no longer lingered on him, how her touch had become fleeting and absent. The late nights, the unanswered calls, the distance. It had all formed an undeniable truth in his mind. And though he wanted to deny it, to push the thoughts away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman he loved was slipping away from him. One evening, as Sophia stood in the bathroom, fixing her lipstick before heading out under the pretense of another work meeting, Ethan made a decision. He would follow her. His heart pounded with the weight of what he was about to do. He wanted to trust her, to believe in their love. But the doubt had become unbearable. As she left, Ethan waited a few minutes before grabbing his car keys and stepping into the night. He kept a safe distance as he followed her down the quiet streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with each turn she took. When she finally pulled up to an unfamiliar building, he felt his stomach drop. It wasn't an office. It wasn't a restaurant. It was a high-end apartment complex. He watched as she stepped out of her car, smoothing down her dress before disappearing inside. The confirmation hit him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't where she said she was, and he wasn't prepared for what that meant. Inside, Sophia barely had time to compose herself before Nathan pulled her into his arms. He kissed her with the kind of intensity that made her forget the life she was betraying, the man she was hurting. With Nathan, there was no responsibility, no exhaustion, no endless nights of feeling unappreciated. There was only raw passion, a hunger that she had long suppressed. But as their lips parted and she looked into his piercing eyes, something in her wavered. Guilt gnawed at the edges of her pleasure. "I should go," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew she wouldn't. Nathan smirked, running his fingers through her hair. "You always say that. And yet, here you are." She hated how right he was. Ethan sat in his car for what felt like an eternity. He didn't need to go inside to know what was happening. His worst fears had been realized. His wife was in another man's arms, in another man's bed. The betrayal cut through him like a blade, leaving behind an open wound that would never fully heal. He wanted to storm inside, to demand answers, to shatter whatever illusion she had built. But he didn't. Instead, he drove home, his mind racing, his heart breaking. This wasn't just about him. This was about their daughter, about the family they had built. And now, it was all falling apart. When Sophia finally returned home, well past midnight, she found Ethan sitting in the dimly lit living room. a look in his eyes that sent ice through her veins. He didn't speak right away, didn't lash out or accuse her. Instead, he simply asked, "Where were you?" The room felt suffocating as she scrambled for an answer, but deep down, she knew. He already knew. Sophia stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of Ethan's gaze pinning her in place. The dim light cast deep shadows over his face, making it impossible to read his expression fully. But she didn't need to see his eyes clearly to know what lay within them. He knew. Maybe he hadn't seen the whole truth, but he had seen enough. "Ethan," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where were you?" His voice was calm, too calm. It was the kind of quiet that came before a storm, a fragile veneer over something much darker. She hesitated, her mind scrambling for a lie. But for the first time in weeks, she found herself exhausted by deception. The excuses, the false smiles, the calculated stories, it had all drained her. But telling the truth? That was an abyss she wasn't ready to fall into. "I told you," she finally said, setting her purse down carefully, as if that simple action could delay the inevitable. Work ran late. Ethan let out a breath through his nose, almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. He shook his head and stood slowly, pushing the chair back with the scrape of wood against wood. "Try again." Sophia's throat tightened. "I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to tell me the truth." His voice was sharper now, the first crack in his composure showing. "Where were you, Sophia?" The silence between them stretched unbearably long. She could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the sound of her own heartbeat drumming in her ears. And then, he said it. "I followed you." Her breath hitched. He nodded slowly, as if he had just confirmed something to himself. "I saw you, Sophia. I saw where you went." Sophia's hands trembled. Panic surged through her veins like wildfire. "Ethan, don't," he cut her off, his voice laced with barely restrained anger. "Don't lie to me again." She swallowed hard, her mind racing for a way out. But there was none. He had seen. He knew. And now, the walls of her carefully built deception were crumbling around her. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, hating how pathetic the words sounded. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "You didn't mean for it to happen? What does that even mean, Sophia? You don't just accidentally cheat on your husband." Tears welled in her eyes. "I was lost, Ethan. After Lily was born. After everything, I felt invisible. I needed—" She stopped, realizing how cruel the words sounded. "You needed what?" His voice was tight, controlled. "Love? Attention? Because God knows I gave you everything I had. I put my career on hold for this family. I stayed home so you could go back to work. I was here, every damn day, loving you, supporting you. And that wasn't enough?" Sophia shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "It's not that simple. But it is." His voice cracked then, the hurt finally breaking through. "You made a choice, Sophia." Silence stretched between them again, heavy and suffocating. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself before he spoke again. "Do you love him?" The question hit her like a slap. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Did she love Nathan? Or had he just been an escape, a fantasy that had spiraled out of control? She didn't know anymore. Ethan saw the hesitation, and it was all the answer he needed. He exhaled, nodding to himself. "I can't do this," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I won't." Her stomach dropped. "Ethan, please." He held up a hand, stopping her. "I don't want to hear it, Sophia. Not tonight." He turned, walking past her toward the nursery. "I'm sleeping in Lily's room." She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing his arm, but he pulled away. The rejection stung more than she expected. And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence of their fractured home.